In a previous video, I showed you how to create a comp using a grid system. Now I want to show you how we actually would create that grid system within our CSS to create a framework. To start with, you need to understand that a grid system includes two key components. They have rows and they have columns. So if we go back to our comp here, you can see that this header area is considered a row and it's got the 12 columns. Then we go to the hero image, it's a row, and inside that has 12 columns. So you can see I've created a container like I would in any other site that I design that's going to hold certain information. And we're going to start now by creating our columns. Now, the first thing we have to do is we have to do what's called resetting the box model. So if you remember, the box model says if you define the width of something as, say, 300 pixels, and you put a padding on the left and the right of 20 pixels each, then the total width of that item is now 340 pixels. Well, we want to remove that. We want to say if the width is 300, figure out how much space we have on the inside of that if I have 20 pixels of padding on either side. We still want that total item to be 300 pixels. So to reset the box model, we're going to reset it on both our row and our column. So we're just going to type out row and we're going to make one for column. And to reset it, it's as simple as box sizing, border, box. Anytime you want to reset the box model, it doesn't even have to be with a framework. You can do that, right? Now we have to think about floats. So obviously we're going to have each row stands on its own, but each column needs to be able to float next to each other. So in order to do that, anytime we have a float in a child, so two divs inside another div that are floating, we have to clear the float on the parent. And there is a video that goes into depth about the clear fix solution. So if you want to learn more about that, go there. But for the purpose of creating our framework here that we can use, I'm just going to go ahead and add it directly into the row. So I'm going to say row before and row after. Our content is none. Oops, let's do this right. And our display is table. And then finally, we're going to come right down here and say row after. And we're going to do clear both. And that's the part that actually clears the float. Okay. Now we get into defining the columns, excuse me. And we define that in two ways. We define everything that's common about the columns, and then we do the actual gutters, which are individual based on each column that you're working with. So the common here is we'll create a column, and we're going to say they all have a position of relative. So this way, if we do put anything that's absolutely positioned inside one of these columns, it's already got a relative positioning attached. And of course, we want them all to float left. The other thing that's common, they're all going to have the same gutter. They're all going to have the same space between. But if we look at our comp and we go back to the grid, you'll notice that the first and the last don't really need a gutter. What we're going to do is we're going to be putting the gutter onto everything that sits next to another column. So for example, column 1 doesn't have a gutter, but column 2 will, column 3. So you have to think about now, if this right here, our navigation goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns, the space would have to come here. So what we're going to do is we're going to write some code that says, hey, if I have a column, if I have a class of column, and next to it, that's the plus, there is another class called column. then that second class of column should have a left margin of 1.6%. And that's the number I figured out for my gutter, right? You can do the math and figure out your own gutter, try to keep it as a percentage. But really what I'm trying to get across here is we have a column, and then we say, but if there's a column next to it, that column should have a margin left. Now we have to figure out the widths. How do we calculate the widths? So there is a big piece of math that goes in this. To figure out the width of your column, a single column width, we have to know what the margin is, we have to know what the maximum columns are. Once you have the single column width, we then need to understand the column widths are for the others. So for example, one column width is this much, but if I have two columns, what's the width for two columns? What's the width for three columns? To do that, we now go to this equation where column width takes the single column width, the amount of column span you have, calculates in the margin, and it comes up with all of those. So this is all the equations that go along with it. In the interest of saving time, I went ahead and created all of my columns right here, and I'm going to go ahead and just grab them and put them into my code pen. Now you can name these whatever you want. For me and for certain frameworks like Bootstrap, there's a standard naming convention where it's col or column. I like col, okay? And you can see over here that this is what we're starting to get, okay? So let's take a look at what we're doing here and how we write the code. So to reiterate, we've reset the box model in the row and the column. We've cleared the floats. We've created a column. We've created the column gutter. And then this here indicates the size. So let's look at how the HTML gets written. So right here, we start with a row. And in my row, I've got a container because I want to keep everything at 1140. In my div, I define the column. I say, look, this is a column, so the columns behave. And this column should run 6. So if you can see right here, this goes across 6. Let me show you. Let's change this to 2. And right up at the front here, let's put one that's 1. So I'm going to do div class equals, and the red guys is just because I want to show you, I want you to be able to see, and I'm going to do call 1. Close that out, and I'll say this is one column, and then I'm going to close that div, and there you go. This is one column. I'm going to go ahead and do a little in my row here. What I want to do is I want to create a row, just give it a little bit of margin at the bottom, just so we can see some separation. Now I can style each row individually as well. Margin bottom 15 pixels, just so it separates out a little bit. If I want to come over here and create a new row, and in my row, I'm going to actually create this row here, and I'm going to say div class equals container because I want my container to hold it. And then I'm going to say I want a class, I want it to have a blue background, I want it to have a column, and I want that one column to be 12. So there you go, you can see that. If I wanted to do this as call 6, I can copy and paste this, and you can see it's 2 columns. So this is how you build a framework for yourself in CSS. This is one way to do it. This is an easy way. It helps make responsive easier. It helps for you to be able to code to your comp and the grid that you're using.